I'm Lillian. I'm a marketing coordinator at Timmons Group. I handle a variety of our external communications, everything from webinars like the one that you've joined us here today for, to social media, LinkedIn management, all sorts of different external communications, fun elements to my job. And one of my favorite parts of my job is getting to sit down with subject matter experts like Joe to learn more about what they have to offer service-wise, for our firm, for Timmons Group, but also to the community. And Joe is a huge proponent of taking the opportunities that he's had at Timmons Group and applying those kind of in a variety of ways, especially when we get to share really unique content with our clients and with other members of the community. So thank you, Joe, for sparking this conversation and for sitting down with us today. I'll give a little bit of a background on Joe. Joe's a professional engineer. He manages our economic development practice at Timmons Group. He specializes in economic development. He has over 2 decades of experience in all phases of project delivery for site selection and analysis, prospect recruitment, and infrastructure and site development. During his tenure, the economic development practice at Timmons Group has helped land over $3 billion in announced investments with
That's
over
actually, 16 billion. So you
six?
have an old bio there.
Oh my gosh, we've got to update that.
Last 5 years have been good and slow for me to get my bio done. So
oh wow, I will take care of that first thing when we hop off of this
and
call.
18,000 jobs. So I've got
18,000 jobs.
Yeah.
That is wild. Well, you've worked on some key projects from Rolls-Royce, Amazon.com, and a ton of others. So you have an in-depth understanding of site identification, selection, and evaluation. And I know that that's 100% accurate because you are about to tell us how you got that experience here on the call. You're also a board member of the Virginia Economic Developers Association and a member of the International Economic Development Council and the Southern Economic Development Council. Are you on any other boards that I ought to mention, Joe?
Yeah, I actually have a little slot on my background, but I serve on the NC State Engineering Advisory Board, and then I just rotated off the Fuqua School of Business board at Duke University. So yeah.
Fantastic. That's great. When you're originally from Farmville, so you're pretty in tune with rural communities in Virginia. And I know you're also an outdoor enthusiast. So you do all sorts of outdoor activities and you love taking advantage of some really neat opportunities in our Virginia and North Carolina areas. So thank you again for being here today, everyone. This is a webinar. So if you have any questions, you can use that raise hand button at the bottom, but we will be discussing Q&A at the end. So you can hold your questions till then. Please let us know in the chat if you have any concerns hearing us or any problems with the Zoom webinar itself. And without further ado, Joe, I'll let you take it away.
All right, thank you, Lillian. And first of all, thank everybody for their time, taking time out during lunchtime today. I know I couldn't buy everybody lunch where you're located, but I'll owe you one for taking a lunch hour to come join us. We're going to cover a lot of information in a relatively short period of time, partly because I haven't done one of these webinars in a while. And there's just been a lot of movement in the industry over the last couple of years with COVID and everything, and a lot of unique things going on. I have never seen the market as robust as it is, where 10 years ago, $1 billion prospect was an extremely unusual thing to see, and now it's commonplace for pretty much all of our clients. So we are going to have some additional webinars in the future. We had done this series for a while, and then we slacked back off of it a little bit because of the COVID situation, and we didn't want to Zoom everybody out or webinar everybody out, but now we feel like it's an appropriate time to kind of get back into it. So thank you very much. All right. Oops. So the agenda for the day, we're going to provide a little bit of an overview of Timmons Group for those of you who aren't familiar with us, a little bit about economic development and site selection trends that we're seeing in the marketplace, especially post-COVID-19. Talk about some of the fundamentals of site and infrastructure development, how we go about finding your next generation of sites, and then kind of defending your community's investment through an ROI analysis. So a lot of communities have looked at this like it's a cost element instead of an investment element, and we help you frame up the best way to do that, and then hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So a little bit about Timmons Group. We do have 18 offices across the United States. We're over 800 employees. We did work in 42 states in 2021. We were established in 1953. We have been an ENR top 500 design firm for the past 25 plus years. We have progressively moved up that list. I think for about the 12th or 13th year in a row, we've moved up the list. We have built our business model to kind of be a full service engineering and technology firm. And presented at a broadband conference yesterday. I was on a panel. And one of the things I discussed was the fact that every business now needs to be technology oriented and data driven in their decision-making processes. So we really have been investing in that for a number of years as a firm, and feel like technology is an accelerator, and the Jim Collins good to great mode is a very important thing. We also do believe in giving back to our communities. We just recently made a 5-year corporate commitment to feed more, in addition to hosting several food drives for the organization. And we try to participate in as many nonprofit organizations that help build community. And I think that's one thing we're really good at, is building community with everywhere we try to work and go. So a little bit about my background. I am a senior principal and director of economic development. As Lillian mentioned, I'm a professional engineer, multiple states, NC State grad. I did a little graduate work, business school graduate work, and had an opportunity to go back and play some baseball at Belmont Abbey as a grad student. Ultimately got my MBA from the Fuqua School of Business at Duke. Over 30 years of experience. And then I currently serve on the NC State Civil Construction Environmental Engineering Board, and as well as I've served on Duke's Fuqua School of Business Board, and currently serving on the Southern Economic Development Council Board as well, and have served as a past board member of VETA and Legislative Advisory Committee Chair. So we follow policy an awful lot, and as we look at site development becoming more and more of an issue, we try to do everything we can to help make sure that our elected officials are aware of some of the policies they need to be making to keep the states that we're in being competitive. So a little bit about our economic development practice. We are committed to our clients' long-term economic prosperity. We have assisted our local government clients close over $16 billion in announced investment, with over 18,000 jobs created, and that's been since 2007, but probably 70% of that has been in the last 5 years. We've seen the market just really accelerate on levels that I never thought we would. We've conducted site assessments for over 600 sites in the Southeast, have performed GIS site selection studies in over 100 localities. We work with site selectors to evaluate sites for prospective companies, as well as helping localities and states prepare sites and infrastructure to be competitive in the marketplace. So some recent high profile projects, we worked with both Virginia and North Carolina on the offshore wind studies, and we evaluated essentially the Virginia and North Carolina ports infrastructure. We looked at essentially where the market was going to go ultimately, and how we could capture that market within the region as well. And I believe there was a lease area that was just leased off of the South Carolina coast and North Carolina coast, where Duke Energy obtained that lease. Dominion Energy also has a lease off the Virginia coast. But within those studies, it came out that there was over 100 billion, and I think the number might be close to $200 billion supply chain market opportunity there, which ultimately has led to cooperative agreements between multiple states. And we're seeing people get together like we've never seen before, and understanding the bigger picture of economic development. So as mentioned on that, if you look at the supply chain that's throughout the southeastern United States when it comes to offshore wind, you can really see how it is driven by a lot of different suppliers and network that exist out there. And it's important to look at this from a market perspective, and then build your site development profiles around that. Some recent high profile projects for us, we were involved with the $2 billion announcement in Holly Springs. That was a 500,000 square foot, it was biotechnology related cell culture manufacturing facility. And that represented about $4,000 per square foot for investment. And that was pretty significant number in terms of dollars per square foot. We helped with site certification on that. There was 5 months from the RFP to the announcement. And you're going to see in my presentation where we see how that timeline is getting shorter and shorter and shorter from the time a local economic developers contact it until a project is announced. So let's talk a little bit about markets, and we like to think of this in markets. So what drives these prospect location decisions? The access to markets. This is an America 2050 map. It's one of my favorite maps, because it makes you realize really where is your product coming from and going. When you look at the impact that we've had in COVID, both from a technology perspective, data center usage has gone through the roof, logistics, has gone through the roof. And if we hadn't had the networks in place that we had, we probably wouldn't have survived that all that well. And we're starting to see a little bit of a resurgence of that. And I know some people who are, starting to catch it back again, but we'll hopefully be able to survive it with relative ease next go around. Fiber access, technology infrastructure, logistics infrastructure, transportation costs, rail, drayage, trucking, shipping costs, total cost of ownership, what are your energy costs and supplies, utility costs, tax rates, capital investment. And then in the last 5 years, sustainability and renewable energy alternatives have become a very important element to the economic development profile and site development profile. And if you look at this map, you can see that in southeastern United States, it's home to 4 of the 8 mega regions with direct access to 6 of those mega regions, which is essentially Northeast and Great Lakes. So talk about some of the trends that we're seeing in the marketplace. So prospects and consultants usually go directly to states and regions. Speed to market matters. Projects move in months and not years. There are a myriad of decision points that influence final site selection. And the most important thing as a local person you can realize is about 100% of your success is 70 to 80% out of your control. So what can you control? The ready to go, publicly controlled sites rule in the market. Due to market drivers, confidentiality is critical. I've seen projects, because they leak out, will go away from a locality. And while markets are constantly changing, however, no matter how much markets change, site and infrastructure development basics remain the same. So control what you can, and that's your sites and infrastructure. And I use the argument about we're using the same engineering principles today as engineers that the Egyptians used to build the pyramids and the Romans used to build the aqueducts. So let's look at what is driving the site selection criteria. And I track this each year with Site Selectors Magazine top location criteria. And we consistently see 8 of these 10 are constantly in the top 10. And a number of them are related directly to what I call the hard assets, the infrastructure assets of things, and things that you can control on some level, but things you need to be cognizant of when they're going through this. Transportation infrastructure, ease of permitting and regulatory procedures. That's really becoming more cumbersome at federal and state levels. And when I get a call from the engineer on the other side of the fence, and he says, what could possibly go wrong with this project that could stop my project from moving forward time-wise? We have to go through all the permitting and regulatory issues that are facing the site and what can trip them up, whether it's entitlement, whether it's a special use permit, whether it's a Corps of Engineers permit. All those items we need to address up front. And then the other thing too that popped into the list was economic development strategy. And the localities that have a product development strategy in their economic development strategy are the ones who seem to be most successful. And the land and building prices and supply, ready to go sites is becoming an issue, and it's an issue throughout the entire Southeast. So kind of some perspective elements relative to the ratings. Smart money has bought up the good dirt, i.e. the smart developers have developed the good sites. Almost all the good sites have been consumed in the marketplace. Most of the available sites are getting consumed in the marketplace. Almost every site now has development challenges, and you have to look at it and say, what can you easily mitigate? While development costs are increasing, they are a one-time expense in a successful business model. When you look at a data center or logistics facility or expanding markets or semiconductors, those costs are one-time costs for the long-term business model. So you need to look at it as long-term ROI, both company and locality. The other element I see is you can move workforce to a good site, but you can't move a good site to the workforce. At times, I wonder if the workforce discussion is part of the convenient excuse for why you didn't get the prom date when a project is announced. But the reality is we have to look at workforce solutions that can serve the good sites wherever the sites are located. Wars and natural disasters, they don't need permits, but everything else does. And then we're engineers. Let's face it, we put a man on the moon. You give us enough time and money, we can do anything. And this business is really a matter of how much time and how much money. And then lastly, one thing to always keep in mind, the landowner, when you're negotiating with a landowner, he has a one-time opportunity to make money, and that's the day he sells or she sells. The state and locality have the opportunity to make money in perpetuity, or as long as there's an investment there and their jobs created. So you always have to keep that in mind dealing with the property owner. So how fast are these projects moving? I put together this table. I've been using it for a number of years, but this represents 10 projects from announcements as far as 10 years back to today, and it represents 13.3 billion investment over 24,000 jobs for 10 projects. 1.3 billion average, 2,400 jobs average, and they made their decisions or announcements within 5 months of the initial contact to that local economic developer. So let's look at the process of product development and prospect recruitment. There are two ways that we look at it. One is pre-prospect planning, no different than a tip-off or a kickoff for a football game. You're working all during the week getting ready for that, okay? And everybody wants to win the Super Bowl. Everybody wants to win a national championship. So you've got to do a lot of preparation work to get to that point. The day the prospect shows up, we call that post-prospect execution. That's the tip-off of the kickoff, and you actually have a defined project that you know you need to try to land, and you need to make smart decisions, because a good deal is a bad deal is no deal is better than a bad deal, and you have to know where that good deal and bad deal line is in terms of your bumpers and what you can do in the pre-prospect planning to increase your odds of success. So we framed this up. We developed this tier system back in 2012, and really what it does, it frames up the logical site development process. And I originally rolled it out with the tier 1 through 5. I had somebody say, Joe, I have no product. Can you help me find products? So we added a tier 0 to it, and we're doing a number of GIS site selection studies for localities and clients to try to help them find the optimal sites. But really, it's a simple logical process for the site development process. We could have done 20 steps. We could have done 10 steps, but the reality is there are really 5 major steps along the way, but each major step matters as far as that process is concerned. But we ultimately want to get to where our market demand is, and that's a certifiable site where I can actually deliver the site infrastructure and site components relative to the timeline it takes the project to come out of the ground and facility to be constructed and get up and running. And for example, Amazon, when they were putting fulfillment centers on the ground, they had 9-month timelines, and literally we were making the project announcements and starting up the motor graders the day of the project announcement, and they were running them 24/7 to meet their demand schedule to get up and running in 9 months. And so we do creative things like we'll do multiple packages for submission, early land disturbance through final building in 3 or 4 different packages. And then we will essentially do creative items like work with an EDC or an IDA to use the project name to put it through the permitting process on behalf of the prospect. So there are things you can do to protect that confidentiality, but also ensure the day you're announced that the project can move forward. So from a local government perspective, what are those steps and how much they cost? Really, it's about how much time and how much effort into it. And we've been able to consistently track these to understand the rough financial investment at each step of the way. Really getting to a tier 3 is the minimum that you need to do. And that's actually going through getting the property under control, going through the site entitlement process, which is site control, comp plan, and zoning, land options or acquisition and political alignment with what's going on site, showing intentionality. Then you go through the master planning, which is getting all your other studies done associated with that. And the costs associated with that are relatively, $1,000 to $2,000 an acre, depending upon the size of the site. But you also have to look at that as an investment. What is the value you're bringing to that site by going through that step? And most often, those sites are increased in value at least $10,000 per acre by the time you've taken that step. So it's a good return on investment of anywhere from 10 to 5 times that, depending on what you're investing. And then you get into the infrastructure components to get to a certifiable site. And then in some locations, maybe up in the mountainous areas of the United States, you might need to go shovel pad ready. Sometimes in the eastern coast where it's a little bit flatter, maybe not. Piedmont is a little bit of a judgment call. So really the tier 4 certified site brings certainty, and certainty brings business, because what we're seeing now in the market is time is greater than money and a distinct competitive advantage in today's site selection world. So let's talk about what's going on in the marketplace. So big cities are out in theory. That was what the Site Selectors Guild predicted a couple right as soon as we hit COVID. But really, there were markets that that really were starting to come back to the U.S. and were starting to significantly increase. Now, it was biotech, life sciences, advanced manufacturing, food and beverage processing, transportation, logistics, and software and IT. And you think about getting the COVID shots, getting the pharmaceuticals done, so we can get those rolled out to the population of the U.S. Advanced manufacturing on a number of fronts. Food and beverage, the demand for food never changed, but the delivery mechanisms did. And then transport and logistics to get there. And then software and IT for what are you going to do when you're at home, working from home? You need access to all those elements. So the advanced manufacturing trends, we're really seeing those come back and reshore. It's pretty significant. These are some pre-COVID items, but the one thing we're really seeing trending right now is AI. That's part of where Amazon has been so valuable, because they do a lot of AI, artificial intelligence initiatives. And we're starting to see that interject and intercede in a lot of different businesses right now. And it's a very important element of moving forward with economic development today. Again, the e-commerce distribution fulfillment centers, JLL has predicted that we would hit about 1.5 trillion in sales in 2025, and I think it's accelerated pretty significantly. Since then, Amazon has the right business to prosper at the right time, and that has shown through their stock increase as far as that's concerned. And so let's take a look at data centers, and I keep this intentionally to a short period of time because this shows how a market change can literally accelerate a market. And so from December of 2019, before we announced COVID was essentially taking place in the US, Zoom had about 10 million users. And in less than 5 months after we had the COVID announcement and shutdown, they went to 300 million users. And all these numbers have gone through the roof. It's been really incredible to watch this. And I know we work with some data center clients that have told us that each data center on the ground is $40 million a year in profit. And so they are accelerating, trying to get that done. And again, it goes back to site development cost or a one-time hit in the business model. So an increase in that sometimes doesn't really matter to a very successful growing business. So EV vehicles, electrical vehicles, and battery manufacturing, that is coming in at a pretty significant rate right now. They're projected that we'll have 10 to 12 million vehicles in demand in 2025. Roughly a 52% annual growth. A large number of the announcements going on in the Southeast are related to the EV industry, whether it's a battery plant or whether it's a manufacturing facility. And then we're seeing this reshoring, nearshoring of overseas industries, pharmaceuticals, medical supplies, semiconductor, computer chips. If you're having a tough time buying a car right now, that's part of the reason why. And I'll talk through some of those elements here. So the semiconductor chip industry, you need it for everything. Goldman Sachs did an analysis, and they said 169 U.S. industries use these semiconductors in their products. Congress has a CHIPS Act proposed. I believe they just passed that, where it's a $50 billion incentives for these manufacturers. But when you look at the marketplace, part of what has happened to the U.S. is we have essentially given our world global position away to Southeast Asia on that issue. In 1990, we produced 37% of the chips. 2021, it's 12%, and roughly 75% of those are in Southeast Asia. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is the one that has made the largest R&D investment, and they build custom chips. Intel has been more just kind of like the Ford model of producing chips throughout that. And so TSMC, which is based in Taiwan, is a legitimate target of the Chinese government to gain control of that industry as they take over Taiwan. So there was an interesting 60 Minutes news article. I was presenting to a client on this issue. And literally, this news article came out the Sunday before I was presenting on it. But it talks about all the different elements that are associated with this industry and why this is hurting the United States. And we've really started to see it from a supply chain perspective take over. So let's talk about U.S. energy infrastructure and where you sit within the context of that. So here's a map showing the southeastern U.S. energy grid. And again, I like to think in terms of markets. I like to think in terms of infrastructure access. But this shows all the different natural gas pipelines, which are in brown, and then it shows all the electrical transmission lines, which are in red. And they're varying sizes based upon the width of the line for these power lines. And then the yellow dots are essentially power plants. Larger the dot, the larger the production capacity for those power plants. So you can really see how important this is. And when it comes to West Virginia and Joe Manchin, who just locked down Congress over the infrastructure bill because he says he's got enough energy, let him build the pipelines getting the gas out of West Virginia. And if you look at, there are two elements here that you can see in dashed lines. One was the proposed, which has since been canceled, Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and the other is the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which is still under construction and waiting a few permits. But this is a critical infrastructure element, especially to the Southeast, and one that I'm sorry that we had to let go of the ACP, but we're dealing with what we're dealing with, and you'll see how this affects everything in just a second. So the other element I look at is world connectivity with both technology and port infrastructure. And this is a map of all the East Coast ports. There are a number of Gulf Coast ports as well too. I think Houston's one of the largest also, but getting the product in and out of the US and back out to the world market. Then there's a technology infrastructure. This is all the transatlantic or cables that go back and forth between different countries. And you see where they enter the US, mostly New York, New Jersey, up in the Northeast, down in Miami, and along the coast in Jacksonville. And I believe there's one coming in Charleston and one in Virginia Beach. So we pulled the largest Southeast US announcements and to see really how that infrastructure matters. And when you look at the total investment of these 14 projects, it was over $28 billion, over 62,000 jobs created. Now, granted, 25,000 of those are the Amazon HQ2 headquarters, but an average of 2 billion, 4,400 jobs. So I looked at that in the context of the overall US energy infrastructure, and you can see the stars and different colors representing different industries. But this was in some of the states in the Southeast, and we picked the top 2 in each state over the last several years. And you can see really how they follow the infrastructure, both energy infrastructure and port logistics infrastructure. The markets do that. So, that's why I think this is ultimately important to pay attention to items like this, because we are not living in a vacuum. And with what's going on in geopolitics, we realize that now. So what are today's heavy power users? Semiconductor plants, data centers, EV manufacturers, EV battery manufacturers, and pharmaceutical processing. So those workforce, site readiness, and timing issues are very critical. So let's go back to the TSMC model. That was a $12 billion investment for the initial phase. That was a 3.8 million square foot plant. That represented roughly $3,160 per square foot investment. 1,900 full-time jobs. They go to 1,129 acre tract. Land purchase was 89 million, and then the incentives and infrastructure alone for the city of Phoenix was $205 million, which represented 62 million in roads, 37 for water, and 107 for wastewater. And then TSMC is also committed to invest up to 100 billion over the next 3 years to meet the chip demand that they're seeing in the marketplace. So let's look at the critical electrical infrastructure associated with that. So this is the star is where the TSMC facility is going to be constructed. There are a number of 230 kV lines feeding that. And you can see the electrical infrastructure, which is just north of Phoenix, Arizona, and how that essentially helps dictate probably their site selection location. So a couple of electrical transmission basics to keep in mind is a 115 and 69 kV lines. They're like a US highway. They do require networking for redundancy, but you can get on and off pretty easily and elements like that. A 230 kV and a 130 kV line, they're like an interstate highway. They have maximum flexibility for redundancy, but there's a lot of electrons moving down those lines. And then a 500 kV line is kind of like air travel. That's going from power plant to power plant, and energy transfer is the intent behind the 500 kV line. So some of these lines here in and around these bigger boulder lines in and around Phoenix, Arizona, are 500 kV lines, and they're going from plant to plant. If you look at the map that I showed a little bit earlier where the power plants were, you would see the bigger red lines, which are electrical transmission, going from plant to plant as well too. So let's talk about the renewable energy profile and high-tech companies that are using this. Facebook announced they were 100% renewable at the end of 2020. Google has intended to do 100% of their purchases for renewable energy in 2020, and it was almost 6 gigawatts. 2030, Microsoft will be 100% energy consumed, matching zero carbon energy purchases. And then Amazon's been a leader in a number of things, but they did an onshore wind farm in Northeast North Carolina to help offset this, but they have a number of significant alternative energy projects, renewable energy projects that they are using for their network. So the other element I did to kind of validate this was I pulled the US EPA Green Power National Top 100 partners. And you can see everything in green is anybody who is already serving over 90% of their electrical use with alternative energy. A number of these are technology and telecoms, but Walmart, which is retail, and a few others are much lower, but this is the top 20, but it just gives you an idea of where the industry is trending. So let's go to the basics of site and infrastructure development, which you need to be planning for. So in the context of the tiering system, in the logical steps of development, Due diligence items and master planning are very important to get to that item, to tier 3 status. One, and that's elimination of your unknowns and your risk, and identifying development costs associated with those. Have these items been addressed? Have you looked at cultural resources, environmental site assessments, wetlands, utilities, worked with your partner utility providers, geotechnical, easements and encumbrances, ALTA surveys, preliminary engineering studies to get to a tier 4 site? In other words, you need to eliminate your unknowns before they eliminate you. And every site selector will tell you it's a game of elimination, which is fine, but we need to understand that in the pre-prospect planning stage as best we can. So let's get to a tier 4, which is your infrastructure and site development consideration. So a number of the people on the call today are either state or local government people, and we don't have a lot of control over what the utilities do, mainly because the utilities have certain confidentiality things they need to do, and they also need to be cognizant of that. So we want to work with them, but they're a little bit more out of control of the state and local people. So we focus on the things that you can control. So when you're looking at developing your future generation, that's transportation, water, wastewater, pad-ready sites. What are your environmental mitigation costs? Partnering and working with your private utilities, natural gas, fiber, telecom, electric, figuring out how best to serve your sites and your localities. And the other thing you need to think about when you're doing this is, that investment in that real estate revenue transaction that can take place, and how that can lend to the bottom line of covering your development costs and or justifying the spend. And I'll talk to that in just a few minutes. So for those who are wondering kind of all the elements, and I don't want to say this is the easy stuff, but this is the stuff that, we spend lots of years studying and figuring out, and lots of studies to get to the point where you can build an interchange. But your access to your 4-lane highways, or do you have an intersection versus an interchange, traffic impact analysis, turn lane analysis, signal warning analysis. The transportation planning usually has the longest lead time of any of the elements of which we have control over. So let's look at water system planning. What are the capacity issues you need to look at? Storage and distribution, design considerations for elevated tanks, domestic versus process. What is your system pressure? You need to have fire flow per the International Fire Code. They're seeing between 2 to 2,500 gallons per minute for 2 hours at roughly 40 PSI. So you need at a minimum 240 to 300,000 gallons required for fire storage, and then you need an operational element above that. So really what we see in a lot of these economic development parks is a minimum of 500,000 gallons for an elevated water storage tank. But what the cool thing is, you can use this as a billboard opportunity for your locality. And here are some of the recent ones that are done, some of the famous ones that were done, of which everybody who drives in South Carolina and goes by Gaffney, South Carolina is very familiar with the beach. Wastewater planning, what is your capacity? You need to look at your collection and your pumping system elements, your treatment capacities. You have peaking factors normally associated with wastewater. They're generally 1.5 to 2.5. You need capacity and expandability, and then process flexibility. And you have to go through a lot of permitting stages to get something permitted with the state for discharge into the environment. But those are elements that you can plan for and you need to look for ultimately. And then reuse, which we call the purple pipe. You can use that for cooling systems or irrigation systems. And then, just to give you some practical engineering kind of not very sexy type stuff. If you look at gravity sewer pipe sizes, we have minimum slopes we need to adhere to, but within those minimum slopes, they give you minimum capacity. So for example, a 36-inch line at the minimum slope can deliver 11.5 million gallons a day. But those numbers go up if your slopes go up as well. So the private utilities, what we recommend to clients is to essentially plan for all those potential utilities that can go into your park. You need to work closely with your utility providers. You want to get underground power if at all possible. And most power companies are pretty receptive to this because really it represents a low maintenance, low cost, low concern element for them. So they're very good about that. But you also, as you're designing a road, and this is an example of a drawing where we had to design a road and towards a mountainous area, we had to plan for all the different utilities because of the challenges of constructing that road. And so we have identified here a red corridor, which essentially is where we would put some of our utility easements, which would be natural gas and fiber and telecom. But you can see the blue line in the road that is considered the waterline as well. So, you know, when you're going through the master planning process, this is an important element to keep in mind as you move forward. Okay, so how do you find your next generation, or what we call next gen sites? And just to note, we will be hosting a separate webinar on this topic. It is a pretty important topic, and because we're getting a good bit of our product consumed in the marketplace right now, and the long lead times associated with getting a site up and running, a number of our clients are asking us to assist them with this process. So I'll be covering this in a separate topic, but today is going to be a high level overview. So we've developed what we call an analytical data-driven site selection process, and we call it the ADS process. We developed this several years ago. We are constantly evolving it with the technology that we use, such that we can better understand the data. But really, when it comes right down to it, what you're doing is you're essentially condensing all the information into one programmable element. And really, this can run as fast as the dating process capacity. I think every time we do a new study for a client, every 6 months, I have to buy my young engineer, my technology test pilot, a brand new supercomputer, because it's getting so data intensive, and it's also getting so data processing oriented that we need to continue to upgrade that computing power. And give you an example, we just wrapped up one for one of our clients, and we had over, by the time we got done, we create what we call smart parcels, where I can literally click on every parcel and it can tell you every bit of information about that parcel relative to development. I can also stitch together several other parcels and put them all together, say, you know, 5 parcels that represent 400 acres. I can put all those together and do a consolidated smart parcel analysis. But essentially, that study we just did for one of our clients, local government clients, we had over 12.5 million data points in the system when we were done with it. So we look at this in multiple ways, and going back to the pyramid analogy, fundamental building blocks is what I call it. A lot of people use the 3-legged or 4-legged stool analysis. I really don't like that, because it implies if you remove one leg, you have an unstable situation or a system that will fail. And that's not the case here. What we want to do is we want to look at this in terms of what are our fundamental building blocks, like pyramids in Egypt, that we can build upon that will be there for a long time, if not forever. And we do the level 1, which is our infrastructure and location analysis, where we put all the different elements together, like power infrastructure, energy infrastructure, look at logistics distribution, look at all those elements, and we say, okay, hey, what are the logical elements that we need to take in mind? Level 2 is the GIS analysis, and that's one I was telling you about, is getting very data intensive, the constraints analysis and what we call geo enrichment. And level 3 is the engineering review and the ROI analysis. And the reality is the computer can only get us but so far through this process. But you know, we need to rely on human judgment at the end of the day. You don't want to go to your doctor and have him turn you over to a computer. You want him to have his judgment with his technology to help you understand what you're dealing with. And again, going back, each step is foundational to that success of identifying those top sites. So really, here's a bigger picture overview that we go through with a lot of our clients, but we try to include stakeholder input. We develop a prioritization matrix, which again can have a significant amount of data in it. We go through this ADDS, have our engineering team review those top sites. We look at what we call anchor parcel expansion. We try to identify those 20 to 30 best sites, go back to stakeholders, and let's put the human and local element back into it, down select to our top 10. Then we go through and do additional engineering analysis associated with it, and we keep moving on. And so some of the key takeaways is this: the objective is to find sites with the highest probability of success. Computer provides an invaluable and irreplaceable resource because it presents what we call an unbiased look at these properties. It doesn't care who owns what. It doesn't care that, you know, this property is in a trust or not. It looks at what the best sites are within that locality. And the most important thing to remember about that is, again, the computer can get us halfway there, but we need that human element. So show me the money. All right, this is where the rubber meets the road. Pretty much all these economic development deals are driven around 3 basic elements. The building or facility cost, which the data prospect shows up, they know about what that costs on a square foot basis. Greatest certainty. Site and infrastructure development and redevelopment costs. How much and who pays? That's usually the greatest variability, and that's what about every deal revolves around. And then land costs, what they're looking for is price certainty, because they don't want the price to go up 4 times overnight when the landowner feels like there's a deal that's imminent. So not all sites are created equal. There are multiple factors that go into the total development cost, from land acquisition to off-site improvements to on-site improvements. And again, a lot of it's just getting smart about what we're doing. So here's a spreadsheet that we prepared for one of our clients. We were on the site selection team, and we had to look at the elements of cost per acre for the land acquisition and the off-site, on-site infrastructure development components of it. And we came up with total development cost. And then we looked at that in terms of a price per acre. And it was interesting because even though we had $50,000 to $75,000 to $100,000 an acre prices, when you looked at total development costs, it was essentially equivalent. And so when we brought our client into town, we said, okay, these are your 3 sites, cost-wise, very effective, pick the site you like. So how do you defend that spend? The end game is jobs, investment, and long-term tax revenue generation. From a local tax revenue perspective, that comes in the form of real estate tax, business, personal property, and machinery and tools tax. That provides for bonding capacity for schools, EMS, social programs, elements like that, in addition to the site development. State tax revenue comes from jobs created and average annual wages. So when you look at this in terms of thinking through it in terms of bonding capacity, and the other element you need to think about, could a 1,000-acre site or 1,600 acre site or a 200-acre site, which would probably be less than 1/10 of any given locality, could that generate 10% or more in tax revenue for that locality? And that's where a lot of people don't understand the element of this, is that small asset can generate a lot of tax revenue for a locality. And so if you look at the annual tax revenue, and municipal bonding seems to be going for about 4%. I did talk to somebody the other day, so they think they're starting to plan for 5%. But again, it looks at that tax revenue gives you significant numbers. And we look at it in terms of the industry types. We have research data that goes back at least 10 years. What are the consistent dollar per square foot investment? What are the consistent jobs per 1,000 square foot? And then what's the average annual data wage? And we can reasonably figure out what this site is going to generate. Now we're seeing unprecedented rise in construction costs and subsequent investments in the market, i.e. we're updating these numbers with the last 2 years worth of data. So let's go through a quick site build out analysis. This is an area where we had identified a site that was upwards of 770 acres, 13 parcels, 8 property owners, currently zoned A1 because we can change zoning pretty easily. But we looked at the myriad of industries that could go there given the profile: logistics, distribution, IT data centers, food and beverage, and advanced or light manufacturing. And so we ran the analysis based upon that. So for potential cost, we looked at estimated purchase price. We looked at the cost to go through tier 3, tier 4, and tier 5 elements to get the site up and running. And then we develop an order of magnitude cost for that and a cost per acre. And then we look at the potential tax investment and tax revenue, and is there a good return on that investment for locality over time? And more often than not, there is. So let's go through a real world example of a semiconductor facility. Well, I guess a theoretical semiconductor, but we made up what we consider to be reasonable tax rates, reasonable personal property, machinery, and tools tax rates, and assumed depreciation. And we do this analysis with real numbers for our clients. Facility size based upon the investment per square foot. What we consistently see is real estate investment, which is a smaller percentage of that. And then we look at business, personal property, machinery, and tools investment. And you get to see really how much revenue you can generate. And then you can look at it from a municipal bonding capacity perspective and what that can generate. So this 2 million square foot of $2,000 per square foot investment will represent a $4 billion investment and can generate upwards of $25 million a year in tax revenue with significant bonding capacity. And if you have 2,000 employees at $85,000, that's $170 million in annual payroll. And consistently throughout the Southeast, with the exception of Florida, state income taxes fall within the 5 to 5.75% range. And so that could generate 8.9 million annually. So let's say you're trying to choose the best site, and this is one of the outputs of our 80 SS process. We can look at multiple sites through the process. We can look at what your site yield will be. We can look at what your total potential investment per acre would be, tax revenue, what your bonding capacity is, estimated jobs, and then we have a developability score, which we use based upon access to infrastructure, site development, elements like that. But this is a typical output that makes it more black and white for an elected official and or economic developer to understand really where their best sites are to move forward with economic development. So wrapping up here, last few slides, communities that are successful in economic development and this is Joe Hines' perspective and partly Timmons Group perspective. They're very proactive and intentional about the site and infrastructure development side of things. They understand that this is a long-term game, not an election cycle buzzword. They have a comprehensive site and infrastructure development strategy, and they not only have it, they execute on that plan. And that's the most important thing to realize is you need to be able to go out and execute on that plan, because these are normally 5 to 10 year elements that you need to put in place, and you need local government alignment. And going back to the election cycle buzzword, you need economic development vision of which your elected officials buy into. They understand their infrastructure and site development costs. They understand their potential revenue drivers, what's going to make them money and what's not going to make them money. They try to remove those political hurdles or risks for prospects as quickly as they can. And then they respect confidentiality and the prospect market sensitivities. So, that's one element that is very important in this whole thing, because there is a lot of competitive advantage that goes with people making a project announcement first. And so they want to check all those boxes associated with that. And we've literally, and everybody on this call has probably seen it happen, seen prospects go away because the word will leak out in the press. And then last but not least, they have the fast track permitting procedures in place, and plain and simple, they get it. So that's the most important thing to keep in mind is your elected officials either get it or they don't. And there's no teaching I can do to them that can convince them if they don't automatically click with it, that can convince them that they need to move forward with economic development. So I'd like to thank everybody for their time, and we're here to make you and your locality successful. And as I said earlier about engineers, we put a man on the moon. Give us enough time and money, we can do anything. But I think the important thing here is everybody working together, we can accomplish anything that we want to accomplish. So with that said, I know I went through a lot of information in a short period of time, and we will be sending a recording out to anybody who requests it, and look forward to having further conversations with everybody. So.
Fantastic. Well, Joe, we've got a question that came in through the Q&A. Do you have a minute for a question?
Sure. Yeah, we got.
All right. This one is Tom O'Grady. He said, rough average cost of site work per acre for a large warehouse or distribution center on a tier 3 or 4 site, $150,000 per acre or $250,000 per acre more?
Like a good consultant answer, Tom, it depends. But I've talked to a number of principals, and we're seeing this construction escalation go up higher than we've ever seen it. And so what was 100 to 150,000 per acre a couple of years ago is actually getting closer to 250, 300,000 per acre, depending upon where you are. And that's being driven for a couple of different reasons. One, again, all the good sites have been consumed. So every site now has development challenges. And because some of these corridors are so hot, and I'll use the Interstate 85 corridor, for example, we're giving those numbers to the clients in the 8 to 10 to $12 million range. And they're like, okay, that's fine. Let's plug it in and go, because they recognize that they need to get that product on the ground sooner than later. So it is a number we're consistently seeing go up. But the good news is the construction cost of these investments are going up as well too. So therefore there's that greater potential return. So the market should track closely with one another. So hopefully I answered that question for you, Tom.
Thanks for that, Joe. Let's see. We've got another question. Transportation infrastructure is number 2 on what matters 2021 from the SS Guild. From the Timmons Group perspective, what prospect of site shoppers require freight rail in the Southeast?
Yeah, Guido, that's and one, it was good meeting you at the SEDC conference in Tampa last fall. But we see a lot of people ask for it, but we also see a lot of people when they get engaged with the rail companies, they realize that sometimes it's not as cost effective as they would like for it to be. Now, with that being said, and talking with the major rail providers, the unfortunate thing is the good rail sites are getting consumed by non-rail users. And I know it's an element they have their eye on and they're concerned about. So when you're getting to know your rail component of your sites, and CSX has National Gateway, which runs up and down the East Coast. Norfolk Southern has the Heartland corridor, which essentially runs from the Virginia port up to Chicago Midwest. We need to try to understand, one, what sites are capable of rail service, and then two, try to preserve those as best we can. So we see a lot of people, again, we see a lot of people ask for it. How many they ultimately end up using it, I'm not 100% sure. I'd say probably maybe about 25% of the people who ask for it ultimately end up using it, would be my estimation.
All right, fantastic response, Joe. Thanks for that. And we've got another question from Jameson. What happens to the Arizona factory when China takes TSMC?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure that China would want to shut down an asset like that in the U.S. So a little bit of background with the Duke Fuqua School of Business. It's an international business school. Interestingly enough, J.B. Fuqua grew up near my hometown area, and my old high school is now Fuqua School, same Fuqua School, but he was big in international business. So Duke opened up a bricks and mortar campus in 2015 in China. And a lot of students who come to the business school are Chinese national students. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the Chinese government has been investing in US businesses since the early 2000s with their annual surplus. Also, too, they have their Belts and Roads initiative, where they're literally investing in other foreign countries. So, you know, while 100 years ago, the sun might not have ever set on the British Empire, today the sun does not set on the Chinese business empire. So I don't think that they would shut down a TSMC facility in the US. As a matter of fact, I think they would do everything they could to encourage it to expand and capture more market share so they can control that. The other thing China is doing that a lot of people don't realize is they're buying up a lot of port and infrastructure assets across the world. I know if you go visit a port right now, you're most likely going to see the gantry crane was produced in China because they cornered that market probably mid 2000s, where they basically became the provider in terms of cost, and they basically lowballed all the other crane providers out there in the world. And put a couple of them out of business, but I still think there are 2 or 3 out there, but they seem to consistently be the low cost provider.
All right. This question comes to us from Michael McFarland. What are some different ways towns can control land and or partner with landowners for future site development if they can't purchase it outright?
Sure. No, Michael, that's a great question, and part of the reason why is because they're property owners who don't necessarily want to give up that control. And in a lot of ways, a local town or county or city, for that matter, can control the fate of a land by how they go about the entitlement process. So the best thing to do up front is work with the property owner and say, okay, hey, if we were to get a prospective deal, what would you take on a per acre basis? And it goes back to this 3 elements. They want cost certainty. And you should have before you spend any public money on that, you should have an option agreement in place that says, we're going to buy it for X dollars per acre, and they don't have the right to go up on that when a prospect shows up. So that is one of the biggest challenges in the industry right now, to be quite frank, is how do we go about partnering with the private land community? And part of it, sometimes they're reluctant to even spend the money to get to a tier 4 site. So the local government will go in and offer to do it. And if they don't use the property for economic development purposes, they can essentially they can sell it to somebody else, but then they have to reimburse the locality for using taxpayers' money to get the site ready to go. And as I mentioned in that matrix, you can spend $1,000 to $2,000 per acre to get through that stage and increase the value of that property, 5 to 10-fold. And then the property owner would take advantage of that if he doesn't use it for the purposes of economic development or what you categorically view as economic development. Then y'all should essentially have him reimburse the locality for that taxpayer's money that was spent on his property. So, but no, great question. There's a myriad of ways to do it, and I think it's going to constantly be changing.
All right, Michael said thanks for that. And I think we've got time for one more question, Joe. It's 12:56. I know we were trying to keep this just under 1 o'clock for the sake of everyone. But this one comes to us from Paul. And he says, many well-served industrial sites have absorbed by fulfillment centers that do not use much of the utility infrastructure. What can communities do to try to match their infrastructure development dollars wisely for the next round of industrial development that they are currently planning for?
Oh, wow. Okay, I didn't see that.
That one is in the chat. So if you need to take a moment to read.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. So a lot of localities are dealing with the challenge of either trying to justify the build out of utility infrastructure with betting on the come. If you build it, will they come? What we can assure you is if you don't build it, they will not come. But you're absolutely correct in that fulfillment centers. And another element that we're seeing too in the marketplace is kind of interesting is with the call for renewable energy, we're seeing a lot of solar farms go on potentially good industrial sites. So I think the important thing for locality to understand is, okay, where is my next generation of sites? Where do I go next with all this? And you want to have as much potential product inventory backlog as possible because it takes so long to get that product up and running and ready to go. I'll use this example about the semiconductor industry. We had several clients who bought large sites in the late 90s and early 2000s and built them out for the semiconductor industry, large heavy water users. But unfortunately, the industry shifted, and as noted in the graphic, it started going to Southeast Asia. So we didn't need those heavy water and sewer users, but we had significant infrastructure in place. And so those ended up going to like fulfillment centers and other things that were not water intensive. But with the reshoring of everything right now, we are seeing a lot more water intensive businesses and sewer intensive businesses coming back to the United States. So I'd be interested in having a follow-up conversation with you about that, Paul. So just give me a call at your convenience. I know you have my phone number, and look forward to talking to you about that as well.
Well, folks, I think that wraps us up pretty well. Some great questions that came in for Joe. Joe's contact information is on the screen in front of you, and we did also record this conversation. So we'll keep everyone up to date with that. And thank you, Joe, for sharing your insights on economic development and how relevant it is and pertinent to everything that everyone's working on right now.
All right, sounds good. And then I think Terry had sent a request to me. If you could just email me that request, and we'll touch base with you about it. Okay, thank you. And hope everybody has a great day, and hope everybody is surviving the COVID surge okay. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks everyone for joining us.